Let's see, progress on the car today. Wasn't able to do much over the weekend, just little bits and pieces. I was waiting for thread sealer stuff for assembling the engine. I'll show that in a second. But I did start cleaning up a few parts, and I went through all my boxes of bits and pieces again. I do that every so often. And I discovered I did have the rear brake pulley. It was pretty beaten up. That's it there. And the edges were all a bit dinged up. It wasn't in too great a condition. But I sort of managed to hammer it fairly smooth, and I just machined off the very edges where it was really ragged in the lathe, and that's come up fine. So that should work fairly well. Which means I can now, once I remove the gearbox, put the last brake pulley bracket in place and run the cable, and then I can finish the handbrake linkage. I've also been trying to figure out what I'm going to do with the clutch. So the way this works on the Brooklyns, and these are proper Brooklyns pedals, is the clutch pedal is pinned to the shaft. So this shaft that goes all the way through will come out the other side, and the linkage is supposed to be on the left-hand side. Because this isn't an original Brooklyns gearbox, it doesn't work that way. So what I may end up looking at doing is extending this shaft out this way and putting a keyed arm on it, on here, attached to the shaft. It has to be detachable on this end because you can only slide the shaft through from this direction, unless I bored out this hole to be bigger. But I don't really want to go messing around with the gearbox casing if I can do it, or avoid doing it rather. So if I have a lever that attaches on this end and another one at the bottom on this shaft where it goes right through, and then pin this through to the shaft, as is normal Brooklyns practice, then that should give me the linkage I require. And somebody did point out to me the clutch, it needs to be adjustable, of course. So you need to be able to set the position of it. But the way the shaft works is with a splined arm on it anyway. So you can always adjust this on here. So that should give the adjustment that I need. And I believe the linkage is just a one-to-one linkage, based on this being the wrong part and this being a clutch pedal, a saloon car clutch pedal. And if you line those up, you can see there's a little bit, this is a little bit longer, but I should be able to work out the length of the arms from this. The good thing is, of course, if I make it so the shaft is keyed, I can make up different arms to fiddle with that clutch linkage there. So that's something else I'll do. I don't really know how much movement you actually need on this shaft, what sort of rotation you need for the clutch. So I'm hoping that becomes clearer once I actually get the clutch assembled on the engine. So that's what's been happening there. And as I say, I've been waiting for sealant for the head studs and for the sump studs, because all of the head studs on this engine go into the water jacket, so you need to seal them. And I spent quite a little bit of time trying to figure out what the best sealant to use was. And people have all sorts of different opinions and different ideas of what they've used. The most common suggestions seem to be Permatex number 2, which is a gasket material. It's quite old school, quite old fashioned, but apparently that'll work. The Permatex people themselves now recommend this stuff, which is high temperature thread sealant. It's got sort of Teflon in it, I think, and it's sort of white, goopy stuff. It comes with quite a cool little nozzle on the end there, so you can actually get it right into the threads. Don't think it'll focus. And that remains pliable for quite a while, and then it'll set up. So that's what I've used. That's what they seem to recommend. And I've got the head studs in, I've got the gasket in place. This is a gasket from the Riley Register Spares. So that comes with instructions, which I've followed exactly as to how to do it all up. The torque, I've torqued it up to 35 foot-pounds at the moment. Obviously, this will have to be retorqued once the engine's run. And I can't remember if you torque them hot or cold. I think on these you torque them cold after it's been run. So I'll have to look that up, but it's a little way off running yet. I also fitted all the studs for the sump, so the sump is on there now. In the weekend I laser cut a gasket for that, so there's a paper gasket in there with Hylamar blue on either side. Normally on a normal sump there's a flange here and the sump isn't quite as wide, so this is a Brooklyn style sump. It's wider, so it's got higher capacity. And on the original ones, because there's a flange on the sump, there are bolts, nuts and bolts that go through, so the bolts go through from here. But because you obviously can't get to the inside of this when it's on the car, this uses studs. So I fitted all the studs and then promptly found several of them are very, very difficult to get to. So this one is under the pressure release valve for the oil pump, the oil system. So I had to use a lower profile nut there and no spring washer. And similarly, the one at the back here near the oil takeoff is in a really awkward place. And the only way I was actually able to get those on was drop the sump down, but not all the way, so that I could get the nuts in there and get them engaged and then tighten them up. And I had a similar problem on the other side, over here where the casting mark is. That actually sticks out enough that I couldn't get a nut on there, so I had to grind some of that away just to be able to fit the nut on. But the sump is all in place now. Hopefully that's all sealing nicely. I did check, made sure everything was tight, everything was done up, there was no gunk inside the bottom of the engine, because that's all sealed now. And I've also, now that I've got the camshafts, I'm pretty sure I've got the camshafts where they need to be. I won't actually know until I get the valve gear on and I can actually rotate the engine and just make sure that's all correct. But I have bolted on the front cover and checked that my thrust washer in the end here is the right thickness to give me the right end float. That all seems good. Again, I laser cut a gasket for this and put blue Hylamar on it. And I've fitted the head, as I mentioned, and I fitted the rocker box covers, but I've discovered a couple of problems there. The first one was they would not sit down correctly. And it actually took me a little while to figure out what they were binding up on. At first I thought it was because these were out of adjustment and it was binding up on the push rods. But what it actually turned out to be is, oh, it's quite precarious there, but there we go. These are the nuts for the head studs. So there's 10 of those. You torque those up in a circular pattern, starting from the middle, of course. What I discovered is my rocker covers were actually hitting the corners of the nuts. So what I've had to do is, with a die grinder, just relieve the inside of the covers so that the nuts wouldn't hit them. I don't know what I'll do if it ends up meaning that when I finally torque these up, it's going to hit. But yeah, it's a little bit odd. You can sort of see on the cover how this bit comes in just a little bit, because there's this semicircular cutout, which is where the water takeoff goes. And you can see it here. This line isn't direct across here. This steps in, so that's why it was hitting. So that was an easy fix. Again, I think this is a symptom of mixing and matching all sorts of parts from different years of engine. There's lots of little tricks like that you have to work around to get this all to work. But with that in place, you can see now how this Y-shaped pipe will feed the oil up to the rocker gear. There are a few other little things that are a bit odd. So you can see this head actually has extra water holes there, but the gasket doesn't. Neither does the block. So this block doesn't have water passages coming up there. So I'm not sure if that makes it an earlier one or a later one. I don't know when that changed or why that changed. Interestingly, my sort of mock-up block sitting over there does have those holes. I suspect it's better without them, because then the water is actually coming up. There's holes in the middle. So I suspect with the holes there, what would tend to happen is the water would just circulate around there. So that's an interesting change. The other problem I've got is, obviously I welded up with hard facing rod and reground the rocker pads. And when I did that, I didn't know what the original thickness was. So I went through all of the sets I had and basically made them the same as the thickest one. Turns out that might be too thick, because with the push rods in, I don't have any adjustment to set the backlash on some of these. So those pads are going to need to be carefully ground down again. I've still got my little jig I used for doing that to get the right radius on them, but that's going to be the next thing to do, and then I can finally get the rocker gear bolted on. What would be next? The water inlet and outlet, just bolt on. The exhaust manifold, obviously, and the inlet manifold and carburetors. So I have tried turning it over. Obviously, it got much harder to turn over after I put the head on, because I had the spark plugs. These are just dummy ones just to stop things falling in there. But I had those done up finger tight, which was enough to give me enough compression that it was actually quite hard to turn it over by hand. I think I also forgot to mention that I did fit the fourth piston, obviously. And this time I did remember to gap the piston rings and fitted them no problem, didn't break any. And that did confirm that, yes, that is what was wrong the first time I did it, when the engine wasn't turning over very easily. After I did it again with the proper gaps, the engine was easy to turn. There was no problem there. So it's kind of getting there. It's getting quite heavy on the stand. There's no danger of it falling off or anything. It just gets a bit, you have to be a bit more careful when you're rotating it around. But I'm hoping now I don't actually have to flip it over again. And what I want to do is I'll shift this little table up next to it. This is a little bit off center, so I may need to jack up under the front of the engine to get it level. But then I can assemble the gearbox onto it, I hope, and start looking at that clutch linkage. But I think that's enough for tonight. It's getting a bit late to be pulling apart rocker gear and grinding things. I do think it's interesting that after you run the engine and you make those adjustments, you have to re-torque down the head nuts. You're going to have to take all the rocker gear off again, just to be able to get to them, which is kind of interesting design on these engines.